Okay, hello everyone, and maybe a slightly belated Happy New Year to all. So not only are we finishing welcoming in the new year, but we are also welcoming in a new draft guidance from the FDA. And those of us here at Emergo appreciate you taking the time to join us for this webinar. We have close to 2,000 people registered for this presentation, so that tells us many of you are just as interested in today's topic as we are. Either that or when I sent my mom a link, she got all her friends to join as well. And if that's the case, I'll just say, hi, Mom, and sorry I haven't called recently. So before we get going, let me introduce you actually to the star of the show, the new CDRH 2022 draft guidance. It made its appearance to the world, compliments of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, the group at the FDA responsible for reviewing medical device submissions, on December 9th, 2022, just in time for the holidays. And during this webinar, our plan is to share with you what it has to say and how we suggest you might apply it during your device development efforts. But before doing that, let's introduce ourselves. So I'm Merrick Kosak, and I'm one of the research directors for Emergo's Human Factors Research and Design team. In my role, I work closely with clients and team members, advising them on best strategies for applying human factors engineering to the development of medical devices to best meet the expectations of regulatory agencies and notified bodies. Before joining the Emergo team, I worked for companies such as GE Healthcare, Baxter Healthcare, and Intuitive Surgical. I'm a member of the AAMI faculty responsible for developing and teaching their Human Factors for Medical Devices course, and also a member of the AAMI Human Factors Engineering Committee. With that, I'll let my colleague introduce herself.
Thanks, Merrick. Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Strolick, and I'm also one of the research directors of our Human Factors Research and Design team. I was one of the co-founders about 17 years ago now, along with Michael Wickland and Jonathan Kendler, and I've contributed to hundreds of medical and combination product development efforts during that time. Like Merrick, one of my core roles is to help our clients and also our colleagues interpret FDA's guidance, as well as other regulators' expectations, and then to help our clients plan and execute properly scoped and scaled human factors programs. I'm a certified human factors professional and a co-author of a book titled Usability Testing of Medical Devices. We'd also like to thank Michael Wickland and Emily Stanzik, who have provided really great insights and enabled us to have some really nice discussions as we prepared for this webinar. Next, I'd like to just talk through our plan for today. So we'll start off with a brief overview of existing FDA human factors guidance documents, and then focus in on the star of the show, the new draft guidance that was just released last month. Specifically, we'll talk you through a special new term that the FDA has introduced in this guidance, and also through a helpful flow chart and some associated decision points to help you react to the guidance and apply it to your product development efforts. Then we'll wrap up by sharing some thoughts on the key impacts of this new draft guidance, and also leave some time for your questions. We want to share a few caveats before we dive into the core content for today. First, we want to clarify that we're sharing our professional interpretations and opinions and judgments of the new draft guidance. We are not speaking on FDA's behalf, nor at their request. We decided to prepare this webinar to help our clients and other medical device manufacturers understand it, to translate it basically, and help you guys look forward to how you can apply this to your product development efforts. And naturally, our interpretations and opinions may evolve as we get hands-on experience working with our clients to apply the guidance in the months and future years to come. Merrick, over to you.
All right, thanks, Allison. Before we actually begin discussing the latest and greatest draft guidance, let's take a brief historical tour of the FDA's human factors guidance over the past 10+ years. So first, let's take a look at some key HFE guidance documents released by FDA's CDRH. After early guidance released in 1999 and 2000, we waited over a decade for the next big thing, the draft of the current guidance we know and love, to be released in 2011. When it was released, the world cheered. Well, at least us human factors engineers cheered. We finally had some direction from the agency that we could use to guide our efforts, educate others within our companies, and most importantly, guidance to help us answer the one big question that we all had: how many usability test participants do I need? Now, 5 years later, in 2016, the key process HFE guidance document, shown in the center on this slide, was finalized. Now, this final HFE guidance presents a risk-based approach to applying human factors, something that's further strengthened by the new draft guidance we're focused on today. Details expectations for preliminary evaluations and formative and HF validation testing. And as I said, specifies that target HF validation test sample size, 15 per discrete user group. The final HFE guidance also provides a detailed outline for a summary HFE UE, Human Factors Engineering Usability Engineering report, that FDA expects to describe all HF work completed during a given device development effort. Now, at the same time as they released the 2016 final HFE guidance, the FDA released a draft guidance shown on the right here, a list of highest priority devices for human factors review, or what became known, at least amongst our team, as the Sweet 16, because it called out 16 device classes for which a manufacturer absolutely had to submit HFE data to the agency for review. Now, while the intent of the guidance was to help manufacturers understand for what device classes they must, as I said, include that HF analysis as part of their submission, we heard from many in industry that if their device was not on this list, well, they concluded the information wasn't required. Some manufacturers were misinterpreting the list to be exclusive and that if their device wasn't listed, no HFE work was needed. So, however, for over a decade now, there has been a steady expectation that manufacturers perform a comprehensive set of HFE activities throughout development. And the new draft guidance we're discussing today will supersede the highest priority devices list, and we assume is intended to better align with FDA's initial intent and HFE-related submission expectations. Now, of course, no tour of relevant FDA's HFE guidance would be complete without a quick mention of guidance released by CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation Research, which regulates drug device combination products. Note that all three of these documents are currently in draft form. So these include human factor studies and related clinical study considerations. This guidance, released in 2016, contains the most relevant HFE expectations specifically for drug device combination products. The document shown in the center here, released in 2018, describes information the FDA would like sponsors to submit in various situations. And the last document shown outlines how to perform threshold analyses and comparative use HF studies. While this is less of a mainstream document, we include it here because it describes very comprehensive threshold analyses, which have some similarities to the UI comparison you might perform when responding to CDRH's new draft guidance. But as I mentioned before, all three of these are still considered draft guidance, and yet they are still followed by industry today, and they are indicative of the agency's expectations regarding drug-device combination products. Now, today we'll be focusing, as we showed before, on the new draft guidance just released last month by CDRH. So a couple of notes. This guidance itself is not a process guidance in the sense of how to apply human factors engineering. For that, you should still rely on the final 2016 CDRH guidance. The goal here is to help manufacturers determine the types of HF data that are minimally required as part of market submission based on the device's risk profile. This guidance applies to all medical device pre-market submissions, including 510Ks, PMAs, de novo submissions, for example. Now, the new draft guidance is only 26 pages long. That includes 15 pages of core content and nearly 9 pages of very helpful examples. So our advice, take the time to read it in its entirety, from start to finish. Don't just skim it. Don't just find the passages that you think are of interest. Read every word. The reason being is that a lot of the nuances are explained, but in simple phrases throughout the guidance. And if you skim it, you do run the risk of missing an important concept, which could result in actually misinterpreting the intent of the guidance. So please do read it. As you might have noticed in your own review of this or other draft FDA guidance documents, the top of all these draft guidances say these key words, draft, not for implementation. And there's a big disclaimer explaining that the draft guidance is not binding. However, past draft guidances, and we assume this one, reflect FDA's current expectations, their latest and greatest thinking on a given topic. While this box says the document will represent the FDA's current thinking when finalized, we believe it reflects their current thinking today as well, even if in draft form and subject to industry feedback and agency refinement. Based on our experience, we expect the FDA to already be looking for manufacturers to start following the guidance before it is finalized, again, based on our experience. So we figured it's worth digging in and presenting some of the key points to help everyone get their 2023 HF work off to a good start. And who knows, maybe performing and documenting comprehensive HEV work is already one of your New Year's resolutions, and this is here to help. So we'll send it over to Allison now to talk a little bit about the HF submission categorization process.
Great, thanks so much, Merrick. Hi, everyone. So FDA's human factors guidance has always been built on a strong foundation of use-related risk management. With the introduction of this new draft guidance document, the use-related risk analysis, and in particular, the identification of critical tasks, continues to be pivotal. In short, the guidance serves to help manufacturers answer one key question. What human factors information should I include with my submission? The guidance includes this new term, HF, human factors, submission category, and outlines the recommended information to submit for each category. Importantly, these HF submission categories have zero relationship to FDA's medical device classification scheme. So class 1, class 2, though both categorization schemes do reflect a device's risk level. So you could very well have a class 2 medical device that ends up in any one of these three HF submission categories. As you can see, looking across the report outlines for these different categories, the content reflects an incrementally more detailed version of the HFE UE report outlined in the 2016 final HFE guidance. So what you'll see is just a building blocks as it goes from HF submission category 1 to 2 to 3. I'll also note that this guidance generally refers to the information to be submitted for categories 1 and 2, and then uses the term HF report when it comes to category 3. Now, what's really nice is in this guidance, the FDA set forth a really clear categorization process to help manufacturers determine which submission category your device fits into. So again, reflecting, sorry, there seems to be a delay in the slides coming through. So reflecting the FDA's principal focus on medical devices safety and effectiveness, the categorization process is risk-based. So one of the 3 decision points that you'll see calls for developing a comprehensive use-related risk analysis and identifying critical tasks. Another decision point relates to whether the new product is a modified version of an existing device by the same manufacturer or not. If it's truly a new product, then the focus goes straight to critical tasks. If you're developing a modified device, for example, let's say you're developing a generation 2 version of a generation 1 product your company is already marketing, you'll want to compare the modified device's user interface and other factors, such as the users, to that of the predicate. So next, I'll show you the highlight of the new draft guidance and the key to answering the key question that I shared earlier. So the FDA provided this really great flow chart. And I'll just let that render here. And so I'll walk you through it in just a moment, and want to point out that it looks fairly simple structure-wise, and it is. It only has 3 decision points, which are questions, and 3 possible results. It doesn't have a lot of twists and turns, but it does require a lot of careful thought. So looking at the flow chart here, you see that top question A is what I just brought up. Is it a new or modified device? And then depending on whether you say yes or no, you follow the flow chart. You go no, you go right to decision point C. If yes, you are modifying an existing device, that sends you on to decision point B, where you're asked to consider the various elements of the user interface, whether they're the same or different. And if there are no differences, that will put you into submission category 1. If there are differences in the user interface, the users, the uses, etc., that'll take you down to decision point C, which is where you do your risk analysis and consider critical tasks. Then depending on the outcome of that item, you either go into category 2, which is if there's not an impact or no additional critical tasks, or if there are new or impacted critical tasks, you find your way to HF submission category 3. So despite the simple structure of this flow chart, manufacturers will need to do some legitimate human factors engineering work, and in some cases, some fairly heavy lifting, to be able to accurately react in particular to decision points B and C. That all said, a decision point A reflects a fairly simple question, one that you might refer to as a softball. Are you modifying an existing device, one that's currently marketed by your company, or not? Don't worry about what's changing or how much it's changing. That's what decision point B is all about. So let's walk through things a little bit more closely here. We'll zoom in for the time being on decision point B. So let's imagine that you are modifying an existing device, so you responded yes to decision point A. Decision point B calls for manufacturers to identify any changes in the user interface, the users, the uses, or the use environments of the existing and proposed modified device. Note that consistent with FDA's definitions used elsewhere, the user interface here refers to every user touchpoint: hardware, software, accessories, labeling, and training. It likely won't suffice to do a quick once-over or discuss these points during a half-hour meeting. Rather, we envision performing a methodical comparison that might lightly resemble the threshold analyses that the FDA calls for when a company is developing a proposed generic combination product and compares it to a reference listed one. The new draft guidance tells manufacturers to, quote, consider providing information comparing the subject and existing devices. And we believe that a structured comparison of the user interface and, as applicable, other factors, for example, the users and their demographics or capabilities, is a valuable tool to enable you to respond to decision point B. So for right now, let's imagine that there is a change, but you're confident that it does not impact any of the factors listed in decision point B. Your device would end up in HF submission category 1. As I talk through the flowchart today, I'll provide a quick example in the context of an AED, an automated external defibrillator. This product is used to analyze the heart rhythm and deliver an electric shock to revive someone from sudden cardiac arrest and restore the heart rhythm to normal. A change that would land an AED in HF submission category 1 would be something like replacing an internal power source. So an internal power supply is changing, otherwise the marketed device is going to be exactly like this modified one. So for example, if you install a battery that will last for twice as long. And we'll come back to that AED as we walk through the flowchart today. So HF submission category 1 calls for the least amount of human factors information to be submitted to the agency. You should state and justify that the device changes do not affect the human factors considerations, users, uses, etc., of the existing device. The guidance indicates that within the high-level summary is where you should leverage and reference any of your prior human factors work that you've done. So again, following that 2016 process document. So this is a good place to showcase your good work, for example, relevant analyses that you've done, and formative evaluations, for example. So now let's take a different situation. You're still modifying an existing device, but in this case, one or more of the changes that you're implementing does impact the user interface or the intended users, uses, or use environments. This would send you along to decision point C, which brings us back to use-related risk. To be able to respond to decision point C, manufacturers need to perform a comprehensive use-related risk analysis, URRA, and identify critical tasks. As many of you know, developing a URRA calls for a multidisciplinary team, including clinical experts, to identify and analyze potential use errors and identify the probability, and most importantly, the severity of any of those use errors, severity of harm that is. The end goal in terms of the HF submission categorization process is to identify if there are any new or modified critical tasks. Most of us human factors specialists can recite the critical task definition almost as quickly as our home address, which now that I'm saying that in front of hundreds of people is probably not something to brag about, but just to be clear, I'll recite it here. So a critical task is a user task or use step that if performed incorrectly or not performed at all, would or could cause serious harm to the patient or user, where harm is defined to include compromised medical care. So looking at this decision point C, if your device does not have any new or modified critical tasks, you would end up in HF submission category 2. One example in the context of the AED is if you were to add content to device training that clarifies, for example, the difference between cardiac arrest and a heart attack. This content would be informative and relevant to the device users, but would not introduce any new or modified critical tasks into the AED workflow. So the minimum recommended information, and that's a phrase that the FDA guidance uses throughout, minimum recommended information, for category 2 builds upon that for category 1. The red text here reflects these additional sections you're adding. And for this category, the FDA is looking for additional details regarding the users, the uses, the use environments, and the user interface, as well as the results of a known problems analysis. In the high-level summary is where you'll want to be justifying why you believe there are no critical tasks impacted in the case of a modified device, or no critical tasks at all if you're developing a new device and you came to this decision point right from decision point A. If your device lands in submission category 2, you performed a use-related risk analysis, presumably a rigorous one, and concluded that you don't have any new or impacted critical tasks. The URRA is a really valuable end product, the kind of thing that would definitely belong in your design history file. Even though it might seem like over-delivering as compared to the minimum information that's outlined by this new draft guidance, you might still choose to include the URRA in your submission. So now let's look at the other pathway that you can take from decision point C. So previously we said that there were no new or impacted critical tasks. Let's say in this case, yes, there is a change to your modified device that does have a new or modified critical task. You'd find yourself in HF submission category 3. Considering our friend the AED, one change that might land you in this category would be the addition of auditory prompts. Let's say if you were programming the device so it could verbally guide users through critical use steps, such as pad placement and shock delivery. You'll see that again, the minimum recommended information for this HF submission category builds on the last, and now we're looking at the broadest set of content that the FDA is requesting. And this is where the FDA in its new draft guidance starts referring to the HF report. And this is the first time among the 3 categories that the agency is specifically calling out submitting the risk analysis and the HF validation test data. We want to remind folks, and you'll hear it more because we think this is a really key point, that this guidance is about the human factors information to submit. It's not a reflection of the optimal HFE process for each category. For example, we believe there are many good reasons to conduct formative and or HF validation style testing, even if a device is in HF submission category 1 or 2 per this guidance. So as I walk through the decision points, I mentioned some examples related to an AED, a product used to analyze the heart rhythm, deliver an electric shock, and revive someone from cardiac arrest. Let's recap the types of device modifications that would lead this device to be in each of the HF submission categories. So the first category, HF submission category 1, is essentially a modification to an existing device without any impact on HF considerations, such as the user interface, use environments, etc. So we gave the example of replacing the battery with one that would provide increased capacity. Category 2 is a new device either without critical tasks at all, or a modified device where the change has not impacted the critical tasks. This would be, for example, changing your training program to include some additional information about the indications, clarify what a cardiac arrest is, but that doesn't at all address or change the information that's already presented on the device itself. HF submission category 3 is either a new device with critical tasks or a modified device with new or impacted critical tasks. And here's where we refer to those auditory prompts. So if you're introducing auditory prompts, this is a new element of the user interface, and those prompts are intended to help users perform critical tasks, pad placement, shock delivery. You would want to ensure that your users could interpret and follow those prompts safely and effectively, and that they weren't subject to any misinterpretation or they couldn't induce any risk, any new use error, excuse me. So in summary, the new draft guidance includes this helpful table. So this is table 1 straight out of the guidance that I'll show you next. And it consolidates the recommended minimum information by submission category. So as you can see, again, this kind of incremental cascading of the information that they call for. I'll now turn things over to Merrick, who will be chatting a bit more about the impact of the new draft guidance and how to apply and present this information in your HF submissions. And Merrick, if you want to come off mute. Great.
Thank you. And hopefully I am showing the correct
Looks great.
screen. So thank you. All right. So as Allison mentioned, I'd like to go ahead now and share some of the thoughts that we've had regarding this new draft guidance and some of our approaches. So the new draft guidance, it's intended to help clarify agencies' expectations regarding HFE activities and documentation. Provides definitions of key concepts, guidance on how to submit use-related risk analysis information, and guidance on how to present or organize your HFE information when including it in a submission. Now, one area I'd like to touch upon are the HFE definitions that are included in the new draft guidance. It has an increased number of terms that we've seen before relevant to the application of human factors engineering to medical device development. In some instances, these definitions are newly added to CDRH guidance. And in some cases, there are terms that might have been previously defined but are now being clarified. The intent is that once this guidance document becomes final, these definitions will then become the de facto standard and will actually supersede those definitions that are in the 2016 guidance. Now, some of these definitions have been added or revised to align with the International Usability Engineering Standard, IEC 6236661. For example, human factors engineering, abnormal use, normal use, use environment, use-related risk. These are all defined in 62366-1, and the definitions are being made consistent in this new draft guidance. But also noting the purpose of the current guidance is to help manufacturers apply a risk-based approach when considering what information to include in a submission. The guidance now defines terminology critical to understanding use-related risk management. So definitions such as harm have been added, and this, along with hazard and hazardous situation, are now aligned with the definitions in ISO 14971, the international standard for applying risk management to medical devices. In that respect, we should note that damage to property or the environment is part of the definition of harm. So it's important for manufacturers to realize this, and it's something to consider during their use-related risk analysis. So in other words, can damage to property or the environment, for example, a piece of auxiliary equipment, can any damage due to a use error result in a possible user or patient safety issue? Similarly, hazardous situation has now been expanded to include exposing property or the environment to one or more hazards. Now, on a related note, All right, on a related note, serious harm and serious injury are newly defined. Serious harm is defined to include both serious injury and death. The definition of serious injury itself comes from the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR 803.3. Our own experience has shown that manufacturers sometimes struggle with deciding what is and what isn't quote unquote serious harm. So providing this official definition should facilitate discussions between, say, development team members, as well as between manufacturers and the agency regarding what is serious and what isn't. So now this is important as the basis for much of the HF work and what information should be included is rooted in understanding critical tasks. As Allison mentioned, those tasks associated with use-related risks that have the potential for serious harm. Another important aspect of the new draft guidance is its discussion about the use-related risk analysis. And the new guidance recommends a risk-based approach when determining what human factors engineering information should be included in a market submission. It's this level of the device's use-related risk that ultimately determines the HF submission category. Now, naturally, the agency will want to understand the results of your use-related risk analysis, and as such, include it with your submission when appropriate. In the new guidance, the agency provides this tabular format as an example of how to document your use-related risk analysis for inclusion in your submission. Now, this table actually isn't all that new. We've seen it before in various CDRH presentations. We've seen it in AI letters to manufacturers, and a similar table is also included in CEDAR guidance. But an important note about this table, it in of itself is not your entire risk analysis. The agency considers this to be an excerpt from a more comprehensive risk analysis, one that includes an analysis of all use-related hazards and risks identified through various preliminary analyses and evaluations, such as a use FMEA, which you might be required to perform to meet your internal organization's risk management procedures, but also include things from, say, a known problems analysis, formative evaluations like formative usability testing, etc. So how might we approach documenting a use-related risk analysis? Well, while the agency has shown here what minimum information related to use-related risk analysis they would like included with your submission, our team would be inclined to add some additional information. So for example, a unique risk ID for each line item. Now this might be the same as the task number shown above in the table, but depending on the nature of your device and how you conduct your analyses, you could have the same task actually listed multiple times and therefore perhaps have the same task number repeated throughout the table. So we usually like to specify a unique risk ID for each line item in the URRA that effectively ties each line item back to a unique risk, say in the comprehensive use-related risk analysis. We also typically include a column for hazardous situation as part of our efforts. Now, the hazardous situation often provides important context regarding the use error, and it might be a benefit to the agency to better understand the overall risk as well, as helpful to those on the program team responsible for developing test scenarios for HF validation testing. Now, if you are generating a use FMEA, it might already include the hazardous situation. But we also see the use-related risk analysis table in this format as also being a great internal communication tool as well. So being able to share a summary of use-related risks with others within your organization where they might get bogged down with all the detail in a use FMEA, this provides a nice summary. But again, we still typically would include a hazardous situation here just so everyone gets that full context. Again, that's our approach. Now, you could also include this table, which the guidance presents as an example when doing a comparative use-related risk analysis. In this case, when modifying an existing device, the bottom table shown here can be used to understand the impact of the modifications on critical tasks. The important thing to note here is that when making claims about critical tasks, whether there are new critical tasks or whether existing critical tasks have changed or remain the same, be prepared to document and explain the rationale for your conclusions. As Allison likes to say, make sure you're able to show your work. And in some cases, even though the URRA might not be listed as part of the required minimum information, it might be in your best interest to include it anyway, again, to show your work. Now, the 2016 guidance explicitly calls for a final HFE UE report, Human Factors Engineering Usability Engineering report, that should be included as part of a pre-market submission and provides a suggested outline for that report. Now, the purpose of this report is to discuss the safety-related HFE considerations, issues, processes, resolutions, and conclusions. The 2022 guidance, interestingly, does not explicitly call out a HFE UE report for submission categories 1 and 2, but rather refers to a recommended structure for the information to be included in a submission. Personally, I suspect this will allow sponsors a little bit more flexibility in how they present the information, noting a report format, quote unquote, is not indicated in these cases. That being said, the information that is to be submitted for submission category 3, for the most part, is the same when compared to the 2016 guidance. And in this case, an HFE, or an HF report, I should say, is referenced. Though again, for the most part, the information is similar. There are some differences worth noting. Now, one such difference is the fact that different levels of content are required depending on the submission category, building upon each other. Now, this is not something that is explicitly outlined in the 2016 guidance. Also, in the new draft guidance, the sections regarding risk are now sequential. So section 6 and 7, as opposed to the 2016 guidance, which suggests having them as sections 5 and 7. It's here within section 6 now that one would include your use-related risk analysis and comparative analysis tables that we just discussed. And our assessment of this is this makes sense from a sequence of activities, if you will. So as you are going through the process of assessing your device, you are looking at summary of known use problems. You are performing preliminary analyses and evaluations, and you're doing this as inputs into creating your use-related risk analysis and doing your risk analysis. So for us, it makes sense for it to be done, presented in this order. Again, it kind of tells the story in the proper sequence. Now, you might also notice a minor difference in the description of section 1. The new guidance actually calls out a quote unquote high-level summary. However, the guidance describes this as a high-level summary of the human factors engineering assessment, rationale, and summary of the processes conducted and analysis of results. It should also include discussion of any residual use-related risk when applicable. Now, this is essentially the same information that is actually also identified in the 2016 guidance. The only difference is that it wasn't called out as a high-level summary, only a conclusion. So if you're seeing high-level summary there in the 2022 draft guidance, don't think that you'll be doing a lot more work. If you're already creating your HFE reports properly, you should already be including the high-level summaries there. So you're already doing the same amount of work. Another slight difference when describing the user interface in section 3. Now, in our experience, User interface screenshots, illustrations, photos are all extremely valuable to demonstrate the design and modifications, especially to an agency reviewer who might not be deeply familiar with your product. Now, this is consistent between both guidances. However, when modifying an existing device, the agency is now requesting manufacturers to consider providing information comparing the subject and existing device. So they provide this example table to indicate how to present differences between the current and modified user interface. And we do recommend taking this step and presenting at least a high level, if not more detailed comparison of the current modified user interface. So will creating this HF report be more work given the new guidance? We don't think it necessarily will be. It's really everything you should be doing now as best practice and in accordance with the 2016 guidance. So our advice to clients at this time would be, for any new projects, start developing HF reports according to this structure presented in the new guidance. Again, this represents the agency's most current thinking and expectations. So why not meet those expectations now? So a few final thoughts and reminders. First one is that once this new draft guidance has been finalized, some of the information, for example, new and updated definitions, will be used to revise the 2016 final guidance. And once that's done, the two guidances will complement one another. They'll work together hand in hand. The 2016 guidance, or whatever it will be called once it's revised, will still outline the activities and process you should follow, and the 2022 draft guidance will indicate what information from those activities should be included with your submissions. Again, we want to be clear that this draft guidance explains what information is required as part of your submission. By considering whether you're developing a new device or modifying an existing device, whether those efforts involve modifications to the user interface, users, uses, or use environment, whether there are any new or impacted critical tasks, using this guidance will help you determine the information the agency expects to receive and hopefully reduce the likelihood of receiving any requests for additional information. Now, this guidance is not meant to excuse you for doing proper human factors analyses and evaluations. You still need to, as we said, show your work. You still need to provide the rationale for your decisions and how you have done everything possible to minimize use-related risk. Another thought is we do recommend you review the hypothetical examples provided in section 6 of the draft guidance. As I said at the beginning, do read the entire guidance. These examples illustrate the risk-based approach for determining what HF information should be included to properly support your marketing submission. The examples walk you through the decision process for determining the proper HF submission category. And finally, continue doing what you're doing. Of course, this assumes you're adhering to the 2016 guidance and you're properly conducting your HFE activities. We would advise you not to start looking to cut corners in the work you're doing. But perhaps you can, though, start having discussions internally to determine if this guidance will or should result in a change to your own internal HFE processes. So, for example, noting that the agency is clarifying what information they require at a minimum, does this change how you approach documenting use-related risk analysis or HF reports? Can you at least save time and effort by starting to look at what HF information needs to be reported to the agency based on the risk level of device development efforts? Now, as you go to start working with this new guidance and you run into questions, how do you apply to the work that you are doing? If you have questions, where do you go from there? Well, there's a couple different sources. We always encourage manufacturers to reach out to the FDA with any questions. consider leveraging a pre-sub, determine whether or not you are actually choosing the proper HF submission category for your submission. Another source of information is obviously our team. Please feel free to contact our global team to help you apply the guidance during your device development efforts. We're always here to help. And another option is to consider, our team has developed a software platform called Opus. It provides HFE training, tools, and templates. And this is something that anyone out there can get a complimentary account to, and there's the URL if you're interested. But one of the many tools and features in Opus, which are intended to help manufacturers perform human factors engineering in a robust and compliant way, one of the tools is a project scoping tool. And it'll help you in addressing questions that you might have regarding applying this new guidance. So yeah, again, another possible source of information and assistance. And so with that, we'd like to turn it back over to Mary Kate for any questions that we might have received. We have a few minutes left and happy to entertain those. And while we're doing so, again, should you have any questions that we don't get to during the rest of this webinar, do please feel free to reach out. Here's our contact information, mine and Allison's emails. Happy to answer any questions moving forward. And with that, turn it over to Mary Kate, but I want to thank you in advance for, again, joining us today for this webinar, and look forward to possibly having future conversations with you about it.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Merrick and Allison, for an excellent presentation, and thank you to everyone who sent in questions to the chat. At this time, a few brief poll questions will pop up on your screen, so if you could take the time to answer those, we would greatly appreciate your feedback. Again, I popped the link to Opus, our HFE software platform, in the chat as well for anyone who would like to learn more about that. It is a complimentary account, so please take the time to sign up. And now we are taking questions, so let's dive in. So question one for you guys, what if I'm currently working on an HFE report for a product development effort where we've already done all of our human factors work and documentation? Should we make any changes to our documentation before submitting?
Either of us. Mary, do you want to start or do you want me to?
Go ahead.
All right. So good question. I would say that you want to make sure that what you're submitting demonstrates proper adherence to the 2016 guidance, but we don't think you'll be held to making changes that reflect this guidance, which just came out this last month. You can certainly read it, as Merrick said, read it carefully, but following the 2016 guidance should put you in a good place, assuming you've done those activities and documented them properly. The draft guidance released in December 2022 actually has a paragraph in it that explains that there's like a 60-day kind of grace period from when the FDA issues the final version of this guidance in terms of it becoming more binding. So we would say focus your efforts for this upcoming submission on 2016. Merrick, anything to add?
No, I think the key there is you don't need to scrap what you've been working on now.
Yeah.
No need to reorganize your reports or anything like that. So
yeah. All right, next question.
Sorry there, I was on mute. I said thank you for that. We had a couple more questions come in and we do have 8 minutes left in our hour. So what if I'm developing a combination product developed by CDER? What should I start to follow this flow chart? Or should I start to follow this flow chart? Sorry, that was on me.
Yeah, all good. So if you are submitting a drug device combination product that you will be submitting to CDER, follow CDER guidance. This guidance that we've been talking about today is from CDRH. It's for medical device submissions. just simply put, you should be following CEDAR guidance and not necessarily this one at this time.
Alrighty. Another question from the chat. If we are modifying a device with no impact to the HFE report, but the predicate was clear, but the predicate was clear before the FDA was reviewing the HF documentation and the agency has not previously reviewed HF documentation for the device, is it advisable to include more information in the submission that the draft guidance calls for in Category 1?
So Category 1 is when you are modifying an existing device, but there are no changes that impact the user interface. If it's about critical tasks, that suggests you would be in HF submission Category 2 or 3. I think you would need to do a full use-related risk analysis, which even if the initial product was put on the market before this guidance came out, you would need to do that now. And I guess the question is, is it considered new critical tasks because the FDA hasn't seen critical tasks and you may not have made that designation when you first marketed the product? Or can you say, yep, we do have these things called critical tasks. They weren't called that 10 years ago when we released Generation 1, but none of them are new. So Merrick, is that how you're understanding the question?
Yes, that's what I'm hearing as well. I think part of it will involve providing a rationale for why that device it can be still considered, safe for use. So if you are just modifying that existing device, you're not changing the user interface in any way. I think it is in your best interest to include a rationale for why the user interface as is safe to use. Yes, I would recommend, personally, including the use-related risk analysis, again, under the idea of showing your work so that the agency does know you have been paying attention to it, that you are monitoring the install base, if you will, doing post-market surveillance and seeing if there are any issues and using that to help provide the justification or the rationale for why, even though you're making these modifications, you're not impacting anything critical, quote unquote critical.
Yeah, we sometimes have clients who are concerned about sharing too much information with the agency, kind of in general, not necessarily related to this guidance. But our team is usually if they want more information, they're going to ask for it. So this is a case where I think maybe oversharing a little bit, even if it's slightly beyond what this guidance calls for your given HF submission category, it's probably wise. So including the risk analysis, for example, to show your work. But it sounds like you'd be in HF Category 2 or 3 if you're making a modification to that kind of device and considering critical tasks.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a couple more minutes here. So when determining if you are modifying an existing device, what of it is a device approved abroad but not with the FDA? What would be a new device or an existing device?
So if a product is marketed in Europe but not in the US, is it considered a new or modified device per the flowchart, basically?
Yes.
I feel like, Merrick, we should count to 3 and say a word at the same time. Do you want to start or do you want me to?
Go ahead.
This is a really good question and it's not addressed in the guidance. My sense, and Merrick may totally disagree, is that it would be considered new to the FDA. So I would say that it is a new device to the agency. So you need to go right ahead to the critical tasks, showing your comprehensive use-related risk analysis, determining if you have critical tasks, which would put you into HF submission Category 2 if not, or 3 if so. But then I think you can very much leverage the human factors analyses and evaluations and even some of the post-market data from your EU marketed product within your information for submission or HF report. So the data that you have, the human factors data, analyses, preliminary evaluations, formative tests, even validation work included as data, but the FDA, I think, will believe that's a new device.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and that's exactly where I was thinking as well. You know, especially when you touched on the post-market surveillance and using, if it's already on the market, even if it's elsewhere, using that information to, you know, that should be an input into your use-related risk analysis that, you know, is included in the information you send to the agency. You know, but when you were saying, you know, count 1, 2, 3, and then we say the same answer, to me, usually to me, that answer is it depends. So I wasn't sure where you're going with that. So.
Fair. If I had to pick new or modified here, I'd pick new.
I would go with new. Yeah.
All right, I think we have time for one quick question. How do you suggest walking through the flow chart if you eliminate a critical task without any impact on other tasks?
Merrick, this is kind of like what we were talking about, impact, right?
Yeah, yeah. So if it will depend on that critical task. You know, what is the nature of the critical task? If it's a, you know, if the task is one that's such, well, you're just making the installation process easier, you know, that's one thing. But if the critical task is, well, you know what, people no longer have to be concerned about acknowledging a certain alarm. Well, that, you know, yes, that might make things easier, but you're still going to want to demonstrate that people are aware of the system state, right? Even if there is no longer an alarm to acknowledge. So I think it's really going to depend on, as I said, the nature of the task that is removed. And I think you need to explore or assess what is the impact on the overall workflow? Does the removal of one critical task perhaps introduce other critical tasks? But if it's, again, just something that is being removed, it no longer has an impact on the workflow, the tasks, the process is now easier for whatever reason. I think you can, you know, you would start probably in category 2 to explain all that, explain the rationale for how things are easier, how the removal of a task doesn't have some other unintended impact that would make you actually be adding new tasks without realizing it and have to then do, you know, go into HF submission 3. Thoughts, Allison?
Generally along the same lines. I think you'd be in HF category submission 2 if you were like totally automating something, so the user doesn't even have, they don't have to enter something, they don't need to confirm something, there's a sensor, you know, it's kind of, it literally, the task disappears. I'd say that I think that HF category submission 2 is still, submission category 2 is still your best option because technically it does impact the user interface. Yes, it impacts it in what might seem like a self-evidently easier way. It's like, oh, one less step. But I think it'd be safe to share the information per category 2 as opposed to only category 1. But category 1 might be fine. Just feels like it carries a little bit of risk to not having that info.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks for the questions. I know there are others, so we'll follow up. Mary Kate, I think you can get us those questions, and then we'll follow up with folks who asked them, I believe, offline maybe.
Yeah. So I apologize we weren't able to get to everyone's questions today. Thank you, Allison and Merrick, for taking the time to present and answer as many questions as possible. This does conclude our presentation on the new US FDA guidance on HFE for medical devices. If we did not get to your questions, as Allison mentioned during the live presentation, our team will be following up via email. And thank you to everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.